Alright folks, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to show you how to turn this into this. Now I'm aware that transition was rougher than a badger's arse, but today I'm going to show you how to butcher a deer within the comfort of your own kitchen. This video is really aimed at the people who have just gotten their first deer, or folk who have acquired a deer carcass and are wondering, what do I do now? We're not doing anything fancy here. We're going to take it slow, we're going to use minimal equipment, and we're going to do it in a small space. The goal of this video is simply just to walk you through how to take an animal and break it down into food. I would usually do this hanging in a deer larder, but I understand not everyone will have access to such a space. And there'll be a lot of folk out there that won't be able to hang their deer at all because they live in a flat. I want this video, and more importantly, I want venison in general to be accessible to more folk. Buying a whole carcass is an affordable way to provide yourself and your family with lean, healthy, local meat. It just requires a wee bit of work, but it's a lot easier than you may think. In this video, I'll be covering how to get a carcass if you don't hunt personally, how to deal with shot damage and other things you might want to look for in a carcass, how to quarter a beast, how to break down a haunch, the shoulders, the loins and everything else, and how to pack and store venison. Everything will be timestamped below so you can skip to or revisit anything you want as we go. Now a disclaimer, I'm not a professional butcher. My job is simply to cull deer, larder them and get them to the game dealers in a safe and clean manner. Most of the deer I shoot go in the public food chain. I only butcher a small handful of carcasses each year for my own consumption. But I have been doing that for about 8 years now. I'm self-taught, I learned how to do this through trial and error, and my cuts aren't perfect. But I want to stress the point that it really does not matter. At the end of the day, your cuts don't have to be perfect or pretty to be edible. And I don't want anyone to be scared to have a go. You'd have to be trying really hard to ruin a carcass. So with all that being said, let's get started. So if you don't hunt, how do you get a deer? Well, here in Scotland, and I'm pretty sure in England and Wales too, one can sell in-jacket venison to the end consumer. Now there is a wee bit of legislation surrounding this and certain rules to be observed, but essentially this means that a local stalker can sell you a whole deer in its skin. So if you don't stalk deer personally but you want some venison, your first port of call is to find out who your local stalkers are and ask them to sell you one. You can do this through good old-fashioned word of mouth, or you can ask on your local Facebook groups. Likewise, contacting sporting estates and commercial forestry companies in your area will help you get in touch with the right people. You can also go through a game dealer and request to purchase an in-jacket carcass, but whether or not they'll sell you it whole really depends on the game dealer and their current workload. Talking of Facebook, however, there is a fantastic group called Giving Up the Game. This is a nationwide group where people ask for, buy, sell and give away game meat. If you are interested in incorporating more game into your diet, it's well worth joining this group. The admins do a great job and there's a pretty good community of people on there. So this is an adult hind, and she was shot in through the base of the neck and out through the shoulder. Now, usually when I'm taking a deer from my own freezer, I pretty much exclusively go for head or neck shots. But if this was your first deer, I'd kind of hope it was shot in the chest. And if you're buying one, you might not have a choice. So I thought I'd show you what damaged tissue looks like, so you can get a bit of a rough idea of what to keep and what to discard. This shoulder is pretty much wrecked, but an often overlooked cut is the foreshank, and this one is still salvageable. Just. Damage to the meat is usually quite easy to spot. There will more than likely be blood and clotting around the area. Potentially shards of bone, and anything that's been subject to trauma will be a little darker than the rest of the carcass. It's best just to discard the shot site and the immediate area around it. It won't make you sick or anything like that, but you'll end up chewing on wee bits of bone, and that's just nasty. There will be more damage up in the neck here, but we'll cut that out as we go. Now if you're buying a carcass, you want the inside to look something like this. Clean and no signs of debris, i.e. foliage or green, which may indicate that the guts have been burst. Most will look like this, and most people who are selling game are trained and will ensure that you have a clean carcass. Though there are bad apples in every community, it's pretty rare that you'll get someone trying to peddle bad carcasses, as those who do tend to get called out pretty quickly. However, always have a look inside before you commit to buy. So as you can see, this girl's still got some of her kidney fat in here. Usually on a female deer, I would save the kidney fat, make it into tallow to use for cooking. I wouldn't bother on a stag, but you can use it for making candles or boot balm or the likes. But yeah, most of this kidney fat is actually in my Labrador. This is just some that was left. So we're just going to take that out and discard it into a dog because Jin's not had any. Besides the point, just take that out if you don't want it. You don't have to do anything with the kidney fat. It's good stuff if you want to utilise it, but it's perfectly acceptable just to get rid of it or give it to your dogs or put it in a bird feeder because the birds quite like it. I've got quails and they love it. But yeah, do what you want with it, just get it out of there because it makes things easier later on. So now we're going to quarter her, which basically means we're going to chop her up into easier to manage pieces by taking off all the legs, taking out all the loins, and yeah, basically that. Usually I do that hanging up, but as I said, most people won't have the opportunity to hang their deer, so we're going to do it on the worktop, which is easy enough to do. And we're not going to use a saw for most of it because you might not have a saw, but you can literally go to B&Q and just buy a cheap saw. It doesn't have to be a bone saw. We'll start with the tenderloins. You'll find them on the inside of the carcass, and to get at them better, you'll want to whip these flanks out of the way. To do this, you're going to follow your knife around the bottom of the ribcage. As you get towards the spine, be careful not to cut into your loin, but don't worry, this is quite hard to do. On the whole, when it comes to breaking down a carcass, you will find seams between the muscles to guide you. It's almost as if the animal tells you where it needs to be cut. The flank attaches to the top of the haunch, and again within the animal's groin. So just work your knife along those seams to free it. And save your flanks. They can be used for mince or jerky, or if you want to get real fancy, you can trim them, tenderise them and roll them with any combination of herbs and spices that you desire. These are the tenderloins, and these are the bougie cuts. They are very expensive to buy, and as the name suggests, they are very tender. So to remove these, I'm just putting my fingers behind it and separating a bit of the tissue there, just gently. Then I'm going up to where it begins and feathering my knife along the inside of the spine. Don't be rough with it, just gently pull as you go and it'll come out no bother at all. And make sure you get the whole lot because it goes quite far down towards the haunch. Now do the same to the other one. Now we're on to the shooters, and these are so easy to remove. With the deer on its side, you're just going to grab the foreleg and lift it up to expose the armpit, for lack of a better word. And under here you'll find a very obvious seam between the front leg and the ribcage, and you're just going to work your knife through all the fat and fascia under there. You shouldn't really be cutting any meat until you get up to where the shoulder joins the muscles of the neck. Again, there are seams here, and you could follow them if you wanted to make a nice neat job of the neck for a roast. But on this one, with the shot damage, I'm just stripping whatever's salvageable on the neck for mince and dice, so I certainly didn't take my time taking this shoulder off neatly. Now we're going to take off the loins. Now, I took a little bit of film before removing the shoulders to show you where the loins run in relation to the rest of the body. Now there is one on either side of the spine, and they run from the top of the haunches all the way up to behind the shoulder blades, so it is best to remove the shoulders first so you can get at these better. Before you start, however, there is a sort of muscle/fascia layer that sits underneath the skin and covers most of the animal's back and sides. You'll take a good chunk of this off with the shoulders, and you will have already taken some of it off with the flanks. I tend to just put this layer in the mince pile. You actually get quite a bit out of it, but we'll revisit that later. To get to the loins, you may wish to peel it back a bit. I just wanted to point it out so you know what you're looking at. Much the same as the inner loins, you're going to feather your way down the spine, keeping as close to the bone as possible to salvage as much meat as you can. Down where the loin meets the haunch there is a seam, but it can be hard to see if your deer is fatty like this. So just take it slow and follow the shape of the meat, and you should manage to remove these in one piece quite easily. So now we're on to the haunches, and I've sawn them off the spine purely to get a better angle for the camera and make it easier to see what I'm doing. So there are different ways to do this depending on what you want to do with your haunches. If you wanted to have an on-the-bone roast or do some dry curing, you might want to leave it on the pelvis and just simply split it down the middle there. But we're not going to do that, we're going to remove the pelvis with our knife. So typically this meat here would be attached to the bone here. I've been throwing this carcass around for filming, so it's torn back a bit. But we are going to cut it off the bone anyway, so it really doesn't matter. So we're going to start by freeing this off the H-bone, then we're going to work our way around. So to reiterate, we're simply just scraping the meat off its attachment to the H-bone and working our way around to expose the femur. The head of the femur is obviously a ball that fits into the socket of the hip, so it's quite recognisable once you see it. As you free off the tissues around it, it will likely pop out of said socket. You'll want to flip your haunch over and feel for a bony ridge. This is the sacrum, or the tailbone, and you're going to want to feather your knife down the side of it, kinda like you did with the loin and the spine. So now you've cut all the way around the haunch, you're just going to expose the femur and it should just pop out nice and easy. And then you're just going to free the rest of it off. And that is you with the whole haunch. So that's the first haunch freed from the pelvis, and now we're going to do the same thing to this one. Now, truth be told, I would usually just saw the pelvis in half before doing this. It just makes it easier to get at. Though I'm not using a saw in this video, I would stress that if you fancy doing this regularly, get a saw. As I said, you can nip to a hardware store and get any old saw, but if you're going to make a habit of doing your own meat, bone saws aren't horrendously expensive. You're looking at about 30-40 quid for a decent one. So now we're going to do the shoulders. This is the nice one. There is a wee bit of damage there where the bullet went in, but it's nothing major, like that'll go in the mince pile, no bother at all. Anyway, there's a couple things you can do with this. You can leave the bone in it and just roast the whole lot, or slow cook it. And I quite like to do that. You can basically pull the venison off and use it for curries, fajitas, you know, anything good you can use it for. You can just chop it all up into stewed ice, which is another option. But what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to take the foreshank off, because I quite like shanks. And there is a steak in here called the flat iron, and it runs down in this kind of portion here. And we're going to whip that out, and then the rest of it is going in the mince pile / stew pile, because I'm doing a wee bit of both. And yeah, that is what we're going to do with this shoulder. The other shoulder, we're just going to salvage what we can, because she's fucked. So we're going to start by removing the foreshank, and you can do this with a saw, but it will leave bone dust everywhere. So it's better to do with a knife, and it's possible to do with a knife, it's just a wee bit fiddly, but you'll manage. So remember how I said the animal kind of tells you where it wants to be cut. There are seams where this muscle joins onto the next one, and you're just going to follow them around with your knife, cutting above the white here, and working your way all the way around, so you've got a radial cut. So once you've cut right round, you can see what's going on a little bit better. This here is the humerus, and it goes down and joins on to the radius and the ulna, which run through here. And we want to separate them. So basically, you're going to open her up, and this is where it gets fiddly. And try and see, oh, it's actually quite hard to see on the camera. Can you see in there? You're kind of wanting to work your knife in through here, and eventually you'll separate that joint. It is very difficult to film because there's going to be a lot of faffing and a lot of like twisting it about to do this, but I'll try my best. So she's opened up a lot more here. This is the head of the humerus here, and this is the top of the ulna sitting on it, and see how you're going to have to kind of work your knife in and underneath there to separate that. I did tell you it was fiddly. Once you've freed enough tissue off, you're going to want to twist the shank back in itself to pop the joint open. If it doesn't go easily, then you need to cut more of the tissue holding it in place. So that says pop the joint now. You can clearly see it's kind of like a keyhole or a jigsaw piece with this bit here at the top of the ulna, which does have a name. I can't remember it. Oh, doesn't really matter. But that sits in the top, the bottom of the humerus here, and they're a pain in the arse. it is also a pain in the arse to cook. But it's fancy, it's nice. You can eat the meat off the bone after you wait 4 hours for the bastards to cook. But they are nice. Anyway, we're just going to free off what's left here. And there we go. Perfect. Not so perfect. It's not the prettiest one in the world. But yeah, nice wee foreshank. You can take the meat off of this and use it for mince, but I will tidy it up and slow cook it when I'm doing a batch of them because they take ages to cook, but they are very, very nice. Okay, awesome. So this is what's left of our shoulder now. And a lot of this we're going to use for mince, but we're going to trim off some of the nasty bits here, like we don't really need the short side and this fat can go. So we're just going to do some trimming right now. Which again just kind of peels apart. You can pull most of this off. So this bit here isn't really worth salvaging. There's a tiny wee bit of meat there, but again, short sight, and most of this is fat. There is a lymph node in here somewhere. But yeah, this will get split and given to my dogs, so that can just go to the side for now. This bit's much the same, but there is a wee bit of meat, so I'll peel that off and put it in the mince pile. But aye, other than that, that can go to the side for now. Right, so now we've got our humerus and our scapula, also known as the shoulder blade, and this is a big flat bone with an obvious ridge to the middle. There are a few different muscles that attach to this, and I'm not even going to pretend to know what they're all called. But one of them is your flat iron stake. But first, there's a big bundle of small muscles attached to the back of the humerus, and to free them off, you're just going to work your knife through the seams that hold it in place. So there's quite a big bit of meat there, but we'll put that aside for now and we'll dice it up later. Anyway, take your scapula and feel for the ridge of bone that runs straight up the middle. It's really quite obvious. And once you've found that, you're going to feather your knife all the way along the side of it, hugging the bone. Okay, and do that on both sides because you're going to save this bit of meat as well. So once you've exposed this bone, there's 2 quite obvious sides. This is your flat iron, and this is just quite a tender bit of meat that you can dice up for stir fry or curry or just whatever you want to do with it. But anyway, that's your flat iron. So this bit is really quite straightforward. You're just following the shape of the meat and freeing it from the bone. As long as you don't cut into the meat, you can't go wrong. You rescued your flat iron, you're going to do the same to the other side and just stick that in your stew dice pile, whatever you want to call it. Now the flat iron does have its fair share of silver skin. Now for the meat that we want to slow cook, silver skin is actually a good thing. When cooked for a long time it breaks down into collagen that is not only good for you but can also help keep moisture in your meat. But for steaks and stir fry dice that you want to cook quickly, the silver skin has to go. When it hits a hot pan it will contract and go tough, making a tender piece of meat more than a wee bit chewy. To remove this, you're just going to skin a wee bit off, just enough to get your knife underneath, and then flip it over. Pointing your knife down away from the meat, you can gently pull the skin and it should peel off with minimal damage to the meat itself. With the rest, we're going to first separate the humerus and the scapula, and save them to use as stock bones. And then we're going to grade the rest of the meat into 3 categories: mince, slow cooking dice, and flash frying dice. Your really tough and fatty bits will go through the mincer. The meat with silver skin will go for slow cooking, and the meat without it will be for flash frying. So from only one shoulder, we've got all this. We've got bones for broth, a shank, a steak, a wee pile for the mincer, a pile of dice for slow cooking, and a pile of dice for flash frying. It's a lot of meat, and it's a lot of meat to lose. Hence why I personally prefer a head or neck shot carcass. With the damaged shoulder, the foreshank had to be sawn off due to broken bones, and I salvaged a few scraps for mincing, but a lot of this went to waste. Now we're on to the loins, and all you're doing here is tidying up the silver skin and portioning them into steaks. It's pretty straightforward. You're just going to get your knife under the silver and, like we did earlier with the flat iron, pull the silver with your knife facing down away from the meat. Once the majority is gone, trim up any white or silver that's left behind and then you can portion it. On the smaller species like roe, I tend to go for 3 steaks out of each, but on your bigger beasts like red and sika, I tend to go for 4. Obviously the tail end of your loin makes for a smaller steak, and you could dice it up with the stir-fry dice, but it makes a good breakfast portion or a child's portion if you've got some of them. The on-the-bone roast that I said was for Christmas dinner is for Rod's family across the road. I'll be feeding my family the loins this year. To cook these I'm first pre-seasoning them and wrapping them up in unsmoked bacon. I'll let them come up to room temperature, sear them in a hot pan, and then roast in the oven till medium rare. But if I were just cooking these for an everyday meal, I wouldn't bother with the bacon. I'd chuck them in a hot pan with a little butter or tallow, and then finish them in the air fryer on the max crisp setting. It gives the steaks a nice crust, while keeping them bloody in the middle. But hey, that's just how I like to do them. So now we're on to the haunches, and this is where you're getting most of your meat, really. And there's a couple options here. You can whip the shanks off, which we're going to do on both of them, and then just leave this kind of top portion here as our on-the-bone roast, which is what we're going to do with one of them because one of these is going to be Christmas dinner. The other one we're going to break up into a few different cuts, mostly steaks and stir-fry dice. But there are other things you can do here. You could mince the whole lot if you wanted to. Some may say that's sacrilege, but if you like to eat a lot of mince, then just mince the bugger. Personally, on a haunch, I tend to keep one small roast and then cut up the rest into very small steaks and stir-fry dice. If you were a big fan of roasts, then there's 3 in each haunch. How you cut your meat is down to personal preference. There's no one way to do it, but in this video, I'll show you one of the ways I like to do it. Right now, I'm just trimming up the outside of the haunch. I've been hanging my deer out of jacket for a few days now, because I like a richer flavour. But when you hang it like that, the fascia becomes quite dry, and together with the silver skin, it's almost like a natural cellophane. But it's easy peeled off, as is the fat. We're going to start by removing the shank. So taking this joint here, feel for the 2 bumps. There's quite an obvious one here and one down here. And if you feel up through the middle of them, there's quite an obvious little indent right there. And you're just going to cut straight through that. So you're going to open it up, and as you can see, the joint's starting to open there. So you're just going to work your knife through this joint, separating all the kind of tissue that's holding it in place. And it'll just come apart as you go. Don't press too hard because you'll blunt your knife. Just work your way through there. Now that you've separated the joint, you just want to cut straight through the meat, but you want to lie it back down to do this. So basically, all you're doing here is cutting straight through the leg. You could take your time with this and make a nice even radial cut to ensure consistency between both of your shanks. And you can trim them up to have clean bone handles, which if you were serving these to guests, then by all means. But personally, I don't care about presentation when it comes to my own meat, because at the end of the day, I'm likely to braise the bejesus out of these and strip all the meat off the bone to make them last multiple meals. However, I will remove the hock tendons on these before I cook them, and the dogs will get them as a chewy snack. So that's you got a pair of shanks, and you can dice these up and mince them if you want to, but I feel it's an awfully shame. Because slow cooked with some port or some red wine, and these are lovely. So now that we've got our shanks off, we're going to break down the haunch into the individual muscles that make it up. There's 4 large muscles in here: the sirloin, the top round, the bottom round, and the rump, as well as the smaller sirloin cap and salmon cut. Now these are all pretty easy to separate from one another, as the haunch is full of these super convenient and obvious seams, which means you won't actually be cutting into a lot of meat at this part in the process. We're going to start with the sirloin, which is this muscle here. It's quite obvious, it's quite round, but there is a wee muscle sitting on top of it called the sirloin cap, or the tri-tip if you're fancy. We're going to have to shift this out the way to get to the sirloin. But that's very easily done. As I mentioned, there's a big seam between the 2 of them. So you're just going to work your way along that seam to peel it back and expose the sirloin. Now the sirloin cap's a pretty small bit of meat on a deer, and I've just left it attached to all the kind of gup up here because I'm going to end up using all that for stew dice and mince, so we'll take it off later. But yeah, this big bulbous round thing is your sirloin, and it's an awfully good bit of meat. And as you can see, there's a big seam here which you can just start to loosen off by working your finger in there. So the sirloin attaches onto the kneecap here, and to free it off you're going to need to make a downward cut in and back towards the femur. Try and stay as close to the bone as you can here, to avoid cutting into the muscle itself. As you can see, the sirloin is also attached to the femur. So again, you're just going to work your knife down the edge of the bone, freeing off the meat. There's no real pressure needed here, just flick your knife gently down the side of the bone and it should fall away, no bother at all. So there you go, that's your sirloin, and yeah, there's a few different things you can do with it, but I'll tell you after I've done the rest of the haunch. So we've taken the sirloin off, and we can see our femur. We've got our kneecap here, this is where the shank came off, this is the sirloin cap still attached, and I've done that for a reason. A lot of folk will debone the haunch before they start butchering it, and that's quite normal practice, but I feel that for the purposes of demonstration, leaving the bone in provides you with a reference point, whereas a deboned haunch can kinda just look like a puddle of meat. With the bone in, however, you can get a better understanding of where all these muscles are in relation to the anatomy of the deer. So this is the bottom round, and again there's seams to show you where it is. If we pull this up here, we can see there's a quite obvious seam underneath it, and round this side there's a seam here as well, which you can kind of just break apart with your fingers. A lot of this you don't even have to use a knife for, you can just start to break the animal apart quite easily without it. Bit of a tough bit there. We're not cutting meat here, we're just cutting the wee connective tissues around it. So we've got it separated, and when we open it out, we've revealed another cut here. That's the salmon cut, and we're going to get that out the way. But first of all, we have in here, which we'll zoom in, this wee kind of grey bean here is another lymph node, and the Americans are very afraid of this one. I'm kidding. But in a lot of the videos you'll hear, you gotta get rid of the gland, you gotta get rid of the gland because it'll taint your meat and all that. When we're doing a bone-in roast, we don't have the opportunity to remove the gland or the lymph node, if you're British. And it does not matter. Basically, don't eat it, don't burst it, you'll be fine. It will not taint your meat or ruin your meat. It's just not very nice to eat, personally. So, yeah, just hoy it out and get rid of it. Now just a wee aside before anyone gets offended over terminology. Though the Americans' term for it is gland, and that's valid because a lymph gland is a real medical term for a lymph node, when we talk about glands and lymph nodes in regards to deer here in the UK, we're usually talking about two different things. The main difference being that lymph nodes are found inside the body, and their purpose is to filter fluids from the lymphatic system. Glands, on the other hand, create and release substances such as oil or scent, and some are clearly visible on the outside of the body. For example, the preorbital gland located in the corner of the eye, or the tarsal or metatarsal gland, which is particularly easy to find in sika deer. As I mentioned earlier, lymph nodes can be found throughout the deer's body. Part of being a trained stalker is checking certain lymph nodes to ensure the animal you have taken is in good health. And I will make a video about that in the future, but right now we should really get back to cutting up that deer. So salmon cut, or whatever you want to call it because it's got multiple names, is really easy to remove. Again, don't cut meat, just gently flick your knife down the seam here and it'll come apart, no bother at all. So yeah, that's your salmon cut, or your salmon steak, whatever you want to call it. Put it to the side for now, and continue on with the bottom round. I'm not explaining this very well. To be honest, I filmed this in a very much half-awake state, so my real-time commentary is not the best. But that's what voiceovers are for. Anyway, you're just going to separate it from the kneecap, again staying as close to that cartilage and bone as you can. And then at the top, you're going to free it from the other muscles by simply just following the seams. So there you go, that's your bottom round. And next to my bottom round, I was taking the sirloin out because I was a bit cat-handed for the camera and I just slipped. But, stress the point, still edible. It's just got a nick in it. I'm going to cut it up anyway. Really, really doesn't matter. Anyway, this is the sirloin tip that we peeled back earlier, or tri-tip, or they've all got so many different names. But yeah, I'm going to put that in the mince pile. This is your rump. And we're just going to free that from the femur and get that out the way, because we don't need that right now, but I will put this up for dice. So now you've got your top round still attached to the bone, but first there's a little bit of the shank left to remove. This is what remains of the shank, and we are just going to free that off. This is going to be tough as shit, so you're going to mince that. Right. And you're just drawing around the bone with the end of your knife, separating it off as close to the bone as you can to salvage as much meat as possible. Okie dokie. So, that's what you've got left. Save that for stock like you had your other bones. And we've got this lovely round piece of meat. So that should now be you with a sirloin, a top round, a bottom round, a shank, a salmon steak, your sirloin cap, your rump, and of course a bone for broth. Though the larger cuts can all stay as they are to be used for roasts, they aren't really realistic portion sizes for everyday cooking. So we're going to break them down a bit further. Now this next part is honestly up to you. It purely depends on what you want out of your meat. Personally, I'm keeping the salmon steak as it is, just trimming up the silver to make it a bit more tender. The sirloin I'll keep as a mini roast. To be honest, I tend to braise this rather than roast it, and on a Sika or a red I tend to get about 4 portions out of it, but you could trim this up for steaks or dice it entirely for stew. Again, it's up to you. The top round is good for steaks, but on this one I am dicing the whole thing up for stir-fry dice. It's all pretty tender, so it lends itself well to flash frying. I have done a young stag, a whole sheep and a roebuck this winter, and as a result my freezer is a bit heavy on the steak front, so I'm keen for a fair bit of dice. However, the bottom round I am cutting into very small flash fry steaks, which may seem like a weird choice, but a typical breakfast for me is a steak and an egg. So these are my breakfast steaks. I saw the ends off my shanks to give the dogs something to chew and just generally neaten them up. It makes them easier to store in the freezer. With the other haunch that'll be an on-the-bone roast, I removed the sirloin cap and the rump, diced up the good bits and stuck the rest in my mince pile. So this is all the scrap from the haunches we have for mincing, and as you can see there's quite a lot of fat in here. If you don't like deer fat, by all means trim it out. I just quite like it, so I'm going to leave it in here. And there you have it. Meat for the freezer. This is what I got from my haunches, but depending on your preference or what you choose to do with the specific beast you're working on, your pile may look different, and that's okay. These are the flanks that we removed earlier in the video when we were quartering up the beast, and if you wanted to be fancy, you could trim these all up, tenderise them, season them, and then roll them up with something inside them, and then grill them, barbecue them, whatever you want to do. But today, we are not fancy. We are literally just going to chop this all up and stick it in the mince pile. Now there's a lot of meat left behind on the rib cage, and some still salvageable on the neck. With this particular deer, I'm stripping it all off for mince. But on a bigger deer, like a young stag or just a bigger hind, I'd salvage the neck roast and I'd saw the ribs off and marinate them for barbecue season. If you don't have a mincer, that would probably be a good way of utilising this meat. Alternatively, you could use the ribs for batch cooking a stew or curry by roasting them and scraping the cooked meat off the bone. Regardless of what you choose to do, don't waste this meat. If you don't want to eat it, but you have a flock of chickens, turkeys or even quails, let them have it for a few hours. They'll peck away at it quite happy, and you'll be surprised how quickly the buggers can strip the bones. This bowl of mince is purely from the flanks and the rib cage. As you can see, it's a lot of meat to pass up on, so salvage what you can. Now that you've got everything cut up, you're going to want to store it, and to do that, you're going to freeze it. Obviously, the main goal of freezing meat is to avoid exposure to the air, lest you want freezer burn. Now the easiest way to do this, and potentially the best way, is to vacuum pack it, but that does mean buying a vacuum packer. I use a Silvercrest one that I got in Lidl for less than 30 quid a few years ago, and it's done about 8 whole carcasses now, as well as a good few birds and fish. It does overheat from time to time, but it does the job. Of course, you don't need a vacuum packer. You will manage fine with foil, freezer bags or cellophane. Just make sure to package your meat airtight and you'll be fine. Portion your meat however you would like it portioned and pack away. It's a pretty straightforward process. One thing I will say though is label and date your meat. If you don't label your meat, you're a heathen and I morally object to the way you conduct yourself. Now there's lots of different guidelines out there for how long you should keep meat frozen. Personally, I don't tend to keep meat past a year just because I'm constantly using it. The longer it's in there, the lower the quality will be. So use it. Eat venison regularly. It's good for your body and your bank account. So to conclude, from just this carcass, I ended up with 5 kilograms of mince, an on-the-bone roast, 6 loin steaks, 2 loin tails, 2 inner loins, 2 300-gram packets of stewed ice, a sirloin mini roast, a salmon steak, a flat iron steak, 6 little breakfast steaks, 2 250-gram packets of stir-fried ice, 2 shanks, 2 foreshanks, and some bones for broth. That is a lot of meat, and that translates to a lot of meals. A hind around this size might cost you somewhere in the £50 to £60 mark. Venison typically is around £2 a kilo in jacket. It does vary depending on who's selling it, but typically £2 a kilo. And yeah, there is some work involved, but buying the equivalent yield in pre-packaged beef or pork would cost you considerably more. Breaking down a carcass at home is an affordable way to fill your freezer with healthy, local meat. But it's also a valuable skill to have. And again, I stress, it does not matter if your cuts aren't perfect. They just have to be edible. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't make the nicest job of this carcass. It's really not my best work. Nor did I explain the process particularly well. It's actually quite a hard thing to demonstrate, and I filmed this in very short pockets of time. But regardless, I hope you got something out of it. I'll likely make a few more similar videos in the future, showing a few of the fancier cuts and working with fattier animals like sheep and smaller game like hare and wild birds. But for now, thank you for watching, and if you're new to processing meat at home, I hope I've encouraged you to have a go.